January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow falls in silence. Not the gentle silence of a winter's evening, but the silence that follows artillery fire. A hollow, ringing quiet that sits in the ears like cotton. The trees are black skeletons against a sky the color of ash. In a makeshift prisoner-holding area behind American lines, a column of German soldiers stands in the cold. Their greatcoats dusted white, their faces gray with exhaustion and something else, confusion. They watch as a convoy of trucks rolls past, canvas-covered engines growling through the frozen air. At the wheel of the lead truck sits a black American soldier, his breath forming clouds in the winter air, his hand steady on the wheel despite the cold. Behind him, more black soldiers, riflemen, engineers, medics move with purpose through the snow. The German prisoners stare. Some of them have never seen a black man before this war. Others have seen them only in the propaganda posters that papered German cities, caricatures drawn to inspire contempt. But here, in the Ardennes, in the dying days of the Battle of the Bulge, they are seeing something their training never prepared them for. Black men in American uniforms, armed, organized, and victorious. One German sergeant, his collar torn and his eyes bloodshot, turns to a younger prisoner beside him. He says nothing, but his expression asks the question that dozens of other prisoners are asking in silence. How is this possible? This moment, this quiet encounter between defeated German soldiers and victorious black Americans, was repeated hundreds, perhaps thousands of times across the European theater between 1944 and 1945. It was a moment that shattered expectations, challenged deeply ingrained beliefs, and forced men raised under the shadow of fascism to confront a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. For 12 years, the Nazi regime had built its ideology on a foundation of racial hierarchy. At the top stood the Aryan, the supposed master race destined to rule the world. At the bottom, according to this twisted logic, were people of African descent, depicted as subhuman, incapable of civilization, unworthy of respect. This wasn't just propaganda, it was law. It was education. It was woven into the fabric of daily life in the Third Reich. German children learned it in school. German soldiers carried it into battle. And when those soldiers encountered black Americans on the battlefield, the collision between ideology and reality was profound. But the story of black soldiers in World War II is not simply a story of shattering Nazi myths. It is a story of paradox. It is the story of men who fought for a nation that did not fully accept them, who wore the uniform of a country that segregated them, who risked their lives to defend freedoms they themselves were denied at home. And yet, despite this injustice, they served with distinction. They fought with courage. They endured hardships that would have broken lesser men, and in doing so, they became unsung heroes. Men whose contributions were overlooked, minimized, or erased in the decades that followed the war. For German prisoners of war, encountering these men was an education in the limits of propaganda. For America, their service was a quiet indictment of its own contradictions. For history, their story is one that must be told in full, not as a footnote, but as a central chapter in the Allied victory. To understand the shock that German prisoners felt when they encountered black American soldiers, we must first understand what they had been taught to expect. In Nazi Germany, racial ideology was not a side issue. It was the core of everything. Adolf Hitler's regime classified humanity into a hierarchy of races, with the so-called Aryan race at the pinnacle and black Africans near the bottom, just above Jews, whom the Nazis considered the ultimate enemy. This ideology was codified into law with the Nuremberg race laws of 1935, which stripped Jews and other non-Aryans of citizenship and rights. It was taught in schools through textbooks that depicted black people as primitive, unintelligent, and biologically inferior. It was reinforced through films, newspapers, and radio broadcasts. By the time war broke out in 1939, an entire generation of German youth had been raised to believe that racial purity was a matter of national survival and that non-white peoples were incapable of achieving the levels of civilization that Europeans had reached. When German soldiers went to war, they carried this ideology with them. It shaped how they saw the world, how they treated prisoners, how they understood the enemy. In the early years of the war, when Germany was winning, this ideology seemed validated. The Wehrmacht swept across Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying efficiency. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies. The U-boats prowled the Atlantic. To many Germans, it seemed that Hitler's vision of Aryan supremacy was being proven on the battlefield. But then the tide began to turn. Stalingrad, North Africa, Normandy. By 1944, the myth of invincibility was crumbling, and when German soldiers encountered the American military, a force that included black soldiers in significant numbers, they encountered something their ideology had told them was impossible. The reality was that nearly 1 million black Americans served in the United States military during World War II. This was a massive mobilization, representing roughly 10% of the total U.S. armed forces. But despite their numbers, black soldiers were systematically segregated, relegated to support roles, and denied opportunities for combat leadership. The military was a microcosm of American society in the 1940s, a society still governed by Jim Crow laws in the South and by unspoken racial codes in much of the North. Black soldiers trained in separate facilities, lived in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and were commanded almost exclusively by white officers. They were told they were fighting for democracy, for freedom, for the 4 freedoms that President Roosevelt had articulated in 1941: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. But they themselves lived under a system that denied them many of those very freedoms. Most black soldiers were assigned to labor battalions, quartermaster units, and service troops. They built roads, loaded ships, drove trucks, and unloaded supplies. This work was essential to the war effort. Logistics won wars, but it was not glamorous and it was not recognized. The prevailing belief among white military leaders was that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage necessary for combat. This belief was not based on evidence. It was based on prejudice. And yet it shaped military policy throughout the war. Black soldiers were systematically excluded from frontline combat roles, from elite units, from positions of leadership. When they proved themselves capable, the standards were raised. When they excelled, their achievements were downplayed. And yet, they persisted. By the winter of 1944, the situation had changed. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, had created a manpower crisis for the American military. Casualties were mounting. Divisions were under strength. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, made a controversial decision. He authorized the temporary integration of black soldiers into white combat units. Thousands of black volunteers, many of them from service units, were given accelerated infantry training and sent to the front lines. For the first time in the war, significant numbers of black soldiers fought side by side with white soldiers in integrated units. They fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. They fought in the ruins of German towns. They fought in the final push across the Rhine and into the heart of the Third Reich. And they fought with a determination that surprised even their allies. Sergeant Edward A. Carter Jr. was one of these men. Born in Los Angeles, raised in India and China, Carter had an international upbringing that was unusual for a black American of his generation. He spoke multiple languages. He had fought in the Spanish Civil War against fascism before World War II even began. When the United States entered the war, Carter enlisted and was assigned to a service unit. But in March 1945, near the German town of Speyer, Carter's unit came under heavy fire. Without hesitation, Carter volunteered for a dangerous mission to scout enemy positions. He led a small team through enemy lines, engaged German forces in close combat, and despite being wounded multiple times, he continued fighting, killing 6 enemy soldiers and capturing 2 others before collapsing from his wounds. For this action, Carter was recommended for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. But because he was black, his award was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross. It would take more than 50 years, long after his death, for Carter to receive the Medal of Honor he had earned. He was one of 7 black soldiers from World War II who were finally recognized in 1997, when President Bill Clinton awarded them the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony that acknowledged decades of injustice. Carter's story was not unique. Across the European theater, black soldiers were proving themselves in combat. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, fought for 183 consecutive days, from the autumn of 1944 through the end of the war. They participated in the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of concentration camps, and the final drive into Austria. They were commanded by white officers, but their ranks were filled with black enlisted men who had trained on outdated equipment and faced constant skepticism about their abilities. And yet they fought with distinction. One of their members, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, continued to lead his tank crew in combat even after being seriously wounded, refusing evacuation and fighting until he was killed in action. Like Carter, Rivers was recommended for the Medal of Honor, and like Carter, he had to wait more than 50 years to receive it. German prisoners who encountered these men found their worldview collapsing. The propaganda had told them that black soldiers were cowards, that they would flee at the first sign of danger, that they were incapable of organized military action. But the evidence before their eyes contradicted every word. The black soldiers they encountered were disciplined, well-equipped, and confident. They moved with the assurance of victors. They spoke with authority. They controlled the roads, the supply lines, the prisoner camps, and perhaps most unsettling of all, they treated their prisoners with a professionalism and humanity that many German soldiers did not expect. There are documented accounts of German POWs expressing shock at the treatment they received from black American soldiers. One German officer, captured in France in the summer of 1944, later wrote in his memoir that he had expected brutality, that the propaganda had told him black soldiers were savages who would show no mercy. Instead, he was given food, water, and medical attention. He was processed through a prisoner-holding area managed by black MPs, military police, who spoke to him with firmness, but without cruelty. He was transported to a rear area in a convoy driven by black soldiers, who joked with each other in English, a language he did not understand, but whose tone suggested camaraderie rather than hatred. For this officer, the experience was profoundly disorienting. He had spent years believing one thing, and now reality was forcing him to reconsider. Other prisoners had similar experiences. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed and the number of prisoners skyrocketed, black soldiers played a critical role in managing POW camps, transporting prisoners and maintaining order behind the lines. They worked in logistics units that ensured prisoners were fed and sheltered. They served in engineering units that repaired infrastructure destroyed by the fighting. They drove the trucks that carried prisoners from the front to the rear, from the chaos of battle to the relative safety of captivity. And in all of these roles, they demonstrated competence, organization, and humanity. For many German prisoners, this was their first sustained contact with black people. The experience shattered stereotypes. It forced questions. It planted seeds of doubt about the ideology they had been taught, but the paradox remained. Black soldiers who fought with such distinction in Europe returned home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. They came home to segregated trains, segregated restaurants, segregated schools. They came home to states where they could not vote, where they could not sit at the front of a bus, where they risked violence for the simple act of asserting their dignity. They had worn the uniform. They had fought the enemy. They had proven themselves on the battlefield. And yet the war they returned to, the war for equality at home, was far from over. This contradiction was not lost on the soldiers themselves. Many black veterans of World War II became leaders in the civil rights movement that would transform America in the decades after the war. They had seen a world beyond segregation. They had fought alongside men of all races. They had tasted respect, and they were no longer willing to accept the status quo. The war changed them. It gave them confidence, skills, and a sense of entitlement to the freedoms they had fought to defend. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the civil rights movement reached its crescendo, many of its leaders and participants were veterans, men who had learned courage under fire, and who now applied that courage to the struggle for justice at home. The German prisoners, too, were changed by their encounters with black American soldiers. Many of them remained in captivity for months or even years after the war ended, held in POW camps in the United States, in Britain, in France. During this time, they had extended contact with their captors, including black soldiers who worked as guards, cooks, and administrators. These interactions deepened the re-education process. Prisoners were shown films documenting Nazi atrocities. They attended lectures on democracy. They participated in work programs that taught them new skills. And through it all, they observed Black Americans performing every role imaginable: leadership roles, technical roles, administrative roles. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The more they saw, the harder it became to cling to the ideology of racial superiority. Not all prisoners changed their minds. Some returned to Germany after the war, still clinging to Nazi beliefs, still convinced that the propaganda had been right, despite the evidence of their own eyes. But many others underwent a genuine transformation. Oral history interviews conducted decades later reveal that some German veterans of World War II came to view their encounters with Black American soldiers as pivotal moments in their lives. Moments that forced them to question everything they had been taught. Moments that initiated a long process of moral reckoning. The symbolic power of these encounters cannot be overstated. For German soldiers raised in a totalitarian state that worshipped hierarchy and racial purity, the sight of a Black man in a position of authority was a direct challenge to their worldview. And it was not just the authority that unsettled them. It was the abundance. American soldiers, Black and white, had access to resources that German soldiers could only dream of. They had ample food, new uniforms, reliable vehicles, and endless supplies. The contrast was stark. German soldiers in the final year of the war were often hungry, poorly equipped, and demoralized. They wore threadbare uniforms. They marched in boots with holes. They fought with dwindling ammunition and outdated weapons. And then they were captured by an army that seemed to have everything. One recurring image in the accounts of German POWs is the chocolate bar. American soldiers carried chocolate rations, Hershey's D rations specifically designed for military use. These bars were dense, high-calorie, and not particularly tasty, but to hungry prisoners they were manna from heaven. And it was often Black soldiers who handed them out. There are stories of German prisoners being given cigarettes, coffee, and chocolate by Black MPs processing them through holding areas. For these prisoners, the gesture was loaded with meaning. Here was a Black man, someone their ideology had taught them to despise, offering them sustenance, showing them mercy, treating them with humanity. The chocolate bar became a symbol, a small, tangible reminder that the world was not what they had been told it was. Similarly, the sound of jazz became a symbol of American culture and freedom for many prisoners. Black soldiers brought jazz with them to Europe. They played it on portable radios. They hummed it. They tapped it out on mess kits. And for German prisoners, jazz was a revelation. In Nazi Germany, jazz had been banned as degenerate music, a product of Black American culture deemed unfit for Aryan ears. But now in captivity, prisoners heard this music for the first time. Some of them were captivated. The improvisation, the energy, the freedom of expression, it was unlike anything they had heard before. Jazz became a symbol of the democracy they had fought against. A democracy that allowed for creativity, individuality, and cultural expression from all its people, including those the Nazis had deemed inferior. The story of Black soldiers in World War II is not a simple story of triumph. It is a story of courage in the face of injustice, of service despite betrayal, of excellence in the face of systemic discrimination. These men were unsung heroes not because they lacked valor, but because their valor was systematically overlooked. The military establishment downplayed their contributions. The media ignored their achievements. And for decades after the war, the narrative of American victory in World War II was told as a story of white soldiers, the greatest generation, celebrated in films, books, and monuments, while the contributions of Black soldiers were relegated to footnotes. It took decades for this to begin to change. It took the civil rights movement to force a national reckoning with America's racial history. It took the work of historians, veterans advocates, and filmmakers to uncover the stories that had been buried. And it took time, too much time, for the nation to acknowledge what these men had done. The belated awarding of Medals of Honor in 1997 was a step toward justice, but it was also a reminder of how long justice had been delayed. 7 men received the Medal of Honor more than 50 years after their actions, and 6 of them received it posthumously. They were dead before their country fully acknowledged what they had done. But the impact of their service extended far beyond medals and recognition. The very presence of Black soldiers in Europe, their competence and courage, their interactions with both allies and enemies, challenged assumptions and changed minds. For German POWs, these encounters were moments of cognitive dissonance that sometimes led to genuine transformation. For white American soldiers who fought alongside black soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge, the experience of integrated combat units often led to changed attitudes about race. Post-war surveys showed that white soldiers who had served in integrated units were significantly more likely to view black soldiers positively and to support integration in the military and in society. The experience of fighting together, of depending on each other for survival, broke down barriers that propaganda and prejudice had erected. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, the roads of Germany were clogged with columns of prisoners, refugees, and liberated slave laborers. The Third Reich was collapsing. Cities burned. The government disintegrated. And through it all, American forces pushed forward, black and white soldiers together, driving toward the final victory. When the war ended in May 1945, more than 2 million Germans were in Allied captivity. Many of them had been captured by American forces that included black soldiers. Many of them had been processed, transported, and guarded by black soldiers, and many of them carried home memories that contradicted everything they had once believed. One veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, recalled his time as a prisoner of war in a camp in northern France. The camp was managed by a unit of black soldiers who had been trained as MPs. This veteran, who had been a fervent believer in Nazi ideology as a young man, described a moment that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He had been working on a road repair detail, part of the labor program that kept prisoners occupied and contributed to rebuilding the infrastructure destroyed by the war. It was hot. The work was hard, and he was tired, hungry, and homesick. A black American soldier, a sergeant, walked over and offered him a canteen of water. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, but for this veteran it was profound. He had expected hatred. He had expected revenge. He had expected to be treated as the Nazis had treated their prisoners, with cruelty, with contempt, with brutality. Instead, he was offered water by a man he had been taught to despise. That moment, he said, was the beginning of his re-education. The legacy of black soldiers in World War II is complex. On one hand, they helped win the war. They contributed to the defeat of fascism. They served their country with honor despite the injustices they faced. On the other hand, their service did not immediately translate into equality at home. It would take years of struggle, sacrifice, and activism before the promise of equality began to be realized. But their service planted seeds. It changed perceptions. It challenged myths. And it gave a generation of black Americans the confidence and the moral authority to demand their rights. For German prisoners, the encounter with black American soldiers was a window into a different kind of society. A society that, despite its deep flaws and contradictions, allowed for a degree of diversity, opportunity, and upward mobility that Nazi Germany never had. They saw black men in uniform, carrying weapons, exercising authority, managing logistics, making decisions. They saw a military that, for all its segregation, still incorporated people of different races into a single fighting force. They saw an America that was more complex, more dynamic, and more powerful than their propaganda had led them to believe. And for some of them, this was a revelation that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The war is almost over. Everyone knows it. The prisoners know it. The guards know it. The air is thick with the smell of spring. Fresh earth, budding trees, the promise of renewal after years of destruction. In the camp, German prisoners sit in groups, smoking cigarettes, playing cards, waiting. They talk in low voices about home, about the future, about what comes next. Many of them are young, conscripts who were drafted in the final desperate months of the war. They are tired. They are confused. They are trying to make sense of a world that has been turned upside down. At the gate, a convoy arrives. Trucks loaded with supplies, food, blankets, medical supplies. The drivers are black American soldiers, men from a quartermaster unit tasked with keeping the camp supplied. They unload the trucks with practiced efficiency, stacking crates, checking inventories, moving with the quiet confidence of men who know their job. The prisoners watch. Some of them have been in this camp for weeks. They have seen these men before. They have come to recognize faces, to anticipate routines, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, their assumptions have been eroding. One prisoner, a former school teacher from Bavaria, sits on the ground with his back against a wooden post. He watches a black soldier directing the unloading, pointing, giving orders, checking lists. The prisoner remembers a lesson from his teaching days. A lesson about race, about hierarchy, about the natural order of things. He remembers teaching his students that some races were meant to lead and others to follow, that civilization was the product of Aryan genius, that the world made sense when everyone stayed in their proper place. He looks at the soldier. He looks at the order, the efficiency, the abundance, and he wonders how much of what he taught was a lie. This is the quiet power of presence. This is the unsung heroism that does not come with medals or parades, but that changes the world nonetheless. Black soldiers in World War II fought two wars, one against the enemy abroad and one against injustice at home. They won the first. They contributed decisively to the second, though the victory there would take decades to fully realize. And along the way, they left an indelible mark on history. They proved that courage knows no color. They demonstrated that democracy, for all its flaws, held a promise that fascism could never match. They showed that the arc of the moral universe, though long, does indeed bend toward justice. For the German prisoners who encountered them, these soldiers were living refutations of Nazi ideology. They were proof that the propaganda was false, that the hierarchy was invented, that human beings of all races were capable of dignity, competence, and greatness. Not all prisoners learned this lesson. Not all were willing to abandon the beliefs they had been taught. But for those who did, the encounter with Black American soldiers was a turning point, a moment when the world revealed itself to be larger, more complex and more just than they had been led to believe. And for the Black soldiers themselves, the experience of service in World War II was transformative. They had traveled thousands of miles from home. They had seen the world. They had fought and bled and sacrificed. They had earned respect on the battlefield, even if that respect was not yet fully granted at home. And they returned to America, determined to claim the rights and freedoms they had fought to defend. The double victory campaign, victory over fascism abroad and racism at home, became the rallying cry of a generation. And though the struggle was long and the progress uneven, the seeds planted during the war would eventually bear fruit. In the end, the story of Black soldiers in World War II is a story about the power of contradiction. It is a story about men who embodied the ideals of democracy, even when democracy did not fully embrace them. It is a story about the collision between ideology and reality, about the slow, painful process of re-education and moral growth. And it is a story that reminds us that heroes are not always celebrated in their own time, that justice is often delayed, and that the most important victories are sometimes the quietest ones. The German prisoners went home. They rebuilt their country. They raised families. Some of them carried the memory of a Black American soldier offering them water, giving them chocolate, treating them with humanity when they expected hatred. That memory, for some, was a seed that grew into understanding, into empathy, into a rejection of the hate they had once been taught. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. But it was real. And it mattered. The Black soldiers went home too. They returned to segregated buses and segregated schools. They returned to a country that had not yet learned the lessons they had tried to teach on the battlefield. But they did not give up. They organized. They protested. They demanded. And slowly, painfully, America began to change. The civil rights movement built on the foundation that these veterans had laid. The sacrifices they made, the courage they showed, the dignity they embodied, all of it contributed to a larger transformation that would reshape the nation. The snow has melted now. The forests of the Ardennes are green again. The roads are repaired. The prisoner camps are gone, replaced by fields and farms and quiet towns. But the echoes remain. The lessons remain. The memory of men who served without recognition, who fought without glory, who changed the world quietly and without fanfare. That memory endures. And it calls us to remember that heroism takes many forms. That justice delayed is not justice denied if we are willing to continue the fight. And that the truest measure of a society is not how it treats its most celebrated members, but how it honors those whose contributions have been forgotten. Black soldiers were the unsung heroes of World War II. They left German prisoners in awe not because they sought to impress, but because they simply served. They embodied the ideals that their enemies had rejected and that their own country had not yet fully embraced. And in doing so, they proved that the arc of history bends not through grand gestures alone, but through the quiet, persistent courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This is their story. This is their legacy. And this is why they must never be forgotten.